So this week we are going to be reading from Parashat Tazria. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or in the Hebrew Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. Hope you guys are taking notes. There's going to be a quiz on this later this evening. Are broken up into weekly Torah readings. Now, most of those Torah readings we do on an annual cycle, but sometimes they're combined, including Tazria Metzora, except when there's a leap month, and of course this year there happens to be a leap month, so Tazria and Metzora are broken up. Now, truth be told, Tazria and Metzora are Torah portions that only maybe a gynecologist and a dermatologist could love. They're all about the exciting topic of things like bodily emissions and a biblical disease known as sara'at, often translated to mean leprosy. And if you had one of these issues, you would go to your local priest, have it formally diagnosed, you would make your copay, and, well, sacrifice was kind of like a copay, I guess. And then there would be particular rituals in order to go through a process of purification. Because these issues were not viewed through the lens of values, it wasn't pure and impure, or clean or unclean. It was a matter of purity and impurity. And if you were in a state of ritual impurity, they wanted to create a process by which you could return to the community in a pure fashion. Not meaning a good or holy fashion, but just a fashion where you could once again participate in the life of the larger Israelite community. And so as we see throughout all of Leviticus, throughout the book of Vayikra, there are a number of rituals and offerings made to help sort of contextualize the unfathomable, the unknowable. Because if you think about it, in ancient days there was much in the world that they were struggling to comprehend. Of course, nowadays it's still very much true about the nature of human life. And so these various rituals, which may seem a little strange to us at times, still spoke about the beauty of our heritage to try and concretize life in a way that was doable and knowable, that was achievable, and that was understandable what was expected of the community. And so I was thinking about that in context with everything going on today. Because there are days where it feels like the weight is almost too much to bear. There are days where we don't even want to think about it or talk about it because we have life. Now, we celebrated Purim, and for a few moments we were able to think about the silliness of our tradition. We've got Passover coming up, where we're going to tell stories from the Haggadah about our redemption as a people, and yet we're struggling with how do we contextualize that within the broader milieu of what's going on in the world. There are days where we really struggle with all the hurt and the pain and the anguish. And then there are other days where it's far from our minds because we're thinking about beautiful things happening in the world, like the cycle of the eclipse, which captured our collective imagination, if for a few moments. And I've often wondered, and it would never happen, but if an eclipse happened on Yom Kippur, could we, for those 4 minutes, eat? So, with all of that in mind, I was thinking about what can we do in moments such as these when we read through a portion like Tazria that is really difficult and messy and clumsy. And so, of course, a story came to mind. The story is about a king. And this king was growing older in years. He couldn't figure out which of his 3 children would be the one to assume his throne and rule the kingdom. His eldest son was strong and brave, a warrior and a leader. His middle son was brilliant, quick, and witty, and he could outsmart just about anyone. And his youngest child, his daughter, had potential, but she was so young. He loved them all equally and wanted each of them to take over the throne. He thought and finally came up with an idea. In the middle of the picturesque royal garden there sat a small shack. Whoever can fill the shack to capacity, the king exclaimed, will take over my throne. Each child would have 7 days to fill the shack with anything they chose. The oldest child decided to go first. His siblings watched as he lugged stones and rocks of all shapes and sizes and tossed them into the shack. Day after day, he carried the heavy loads. When there was no more room left, he filled the cracks and crevices with small pebbles to fill the room to capacity. At the end of the week, the king walked down the winding, narrow path that led into the garden and reached out to open the door of the shack. "My son," the king said as he smiled, "you have filled the shack to capacity. You may yet be the next king." He then ordered his servants to empty the shack. The middle son, the smartest and fastest, took his turn to try and outwit his brother. The others watched as he ran back and forth from the chicken coop to the shack, carrying bags and bags full of feathers, dumping the feathers into the shack time after time. When there was no more room in the shack, he jumped on the feathers to make space for more. Before long, the entire shack was filled to capacity with feathers, and so was the rest of the garden. At the end of the week, the king came walking down the winding, narrow path that led into the garden. The entire garden looked white as snow. The king reached out his hand and opened the door. "You have surpassed your brother," exclaimed the king. With the rocks, there were still small holes left over in the crevices. With feathers, however, you have managed to fill the room to capacity. You may yet be the next king. Once again, he ordered his servants to empty the shack, who were much more grateful to take out feathers as opposed to rocks. It was now the youngest child's turn. The brothers pleaded with their father not to let her compete, or at least to wait until she was older. "She doesn't understand, father. This is a whole kingdom on her shoulders," they declared. The king would not hear of it. "You each got your turn, now it's hers." The first day passed and the shack was empty. The second day and the shack was still empty. The third day, still nothing had changed. By now the townspeople had heard of the competition and began crowding around the palace, wondering what the princess had planned. The fourth day passed and the shack was still empty. The brothers continued to plead with their father. "She is making a mockery of the throne." But the king just waited. The fifth and sixth day passed and the shack remained empty. On the seventh day, the king walked down the winding, narrow path that led into the scenic garden. Only this time he was not alone. Scores and scores of people followed behind him, wondering and waiting for what. The king reached out his hand to open the shack. People pushed and shoved to try and get a view. A stillness passed over the crowd. The door opened and the shack was empty. Yet before a word could be uttered, the young princess passed under the arm of her father and headed straight into the shack. She knelt down, reached into the folds of her robes, and revealed a candlestick. She reached back into the folds of her robes and pulled out a candle. She proceeded to light the candle, and the entire shack was filled to capacity with light. The king smiled. "You, my child, will take over my throne." The crowd cheered, and the brothers also cheered, and all was as it should be. In times such as these, where we read of rituals to help try and make sense of the unfathomable, we have an opportunity as well, even if we struggle, even as we hurt, even as we cry. And that is the option to be a light of goodness, to be a light of love, to be a light of compassion, to be a light of relationship, to be a light of guidance, to be a light of holiness. We may not be able to solve all the problems in the world, and certainly not the problems going on over in the Middle East. But if we can be a light, we can illuminate the sacred and the holy in each other. And maybe that might just be enough of a blessing to inspire others to be a light as well. Shabbat Shalom.